Hello, everyone. Welcome to the RSIS webinar series on the economic multilateralism for post-COVID-19 recovery. This is the third and last webinar of this series. We'll be focusing on the economic resilience and security in Southeast Asia and ASEAN. Thank you very much for joining us today. I am Karen Pitak-Murongit, Deputy Head of the Center for Multilateralism Studies at RSIS. I'm the chair of this session. So just to give you the context of this webinar, not only the COVID-19 pandemic, but also other transnational problems such as climate change and cyber attacks have posed unprecedented challenges to Southeast Asian economies. These issues have raised the importance of the notions of economic resilience and economic security. As a result, these concepts have been incorporated into the post-COVID-19 recovery plan of regional states as well as ASEAN. For example, in November last year, ASEAN endorsed ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, or ACRF, which serves as a consolidated community-wide exit strategy from the pandemic. The ACRF has 5 strategies, which one of them focusing on regional resilience and sustainability. Against this backdrop, this webinar will examine further the notions of the economic resilience and economic security. We will do so by asking the following questions. 1, how are these concepts understood and addressed in Southeast Asia and ASEAN? 2, what are the implications of the debates over these issues for the engagement of Southeast Asian states in the economic multilateralism and long-term trends in ASEAN? We have 3 distinguished experts here today with us who will shed light on these questions. You already have their bio, but let me introduce them briefly to you again. So the first one is Ms. Sunny Park, Assistant General Counsel of Microsoft. The second one is Dr. Jayant Menon, Visiting Senior Fellow at ICS Yusof Institute in Singapore. And last but not least, we have Professor Kai He, Professor of International Relations and Director of Center for Governance and Public Policy at Griffith University in Australia. So each expert will talk for 12 to 15 minutes, and I will give a reminder as they close to their time limit. After that, we will move on to the Q&A session. So please be noted that in this webinar, your chat and raise hand functions have been disabled. So if you would like to submit your questions, please do so by clicking on the Q&A button icon below. So I'll be the one who selects the questions to ask the panelists. Without further ado, let us turn to our first speaker, Sunny, for her presentation. Sunny, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, sorry, I used.
Yes. Okay, great.
Good afternoon. Thank you. I'd like to begin by thanking RSIS for inviting me to participate in today's conversation and share my perspective on a path to economic recovery. We live in challenging times, and pandemic has been both a great divider and a great equalizer, offering us an opportunity to reset and rebuild with great inclusion and resilience. Almost 2 years since COVID-19 first struck our shores, we have seen how the devastating effects of the pandemic have impacted us in unprecedented, profound, and often disproportionate ways. This has resulted in job losses, food insecurity, children abandoning school, and a mental health crisis that hasn't spared anyone. In the Asia Pacific, as we move forward to recovery, I'd like to discuss 4 factors that can impact economic resilience from a technology perspective: digital infrastructure and use of data, cybersecurity, tech policies, and skilling. As we saw, COVID-19 evolve from a health crisis to a social crisis to an economic crisis. It has been described as the worst recession since the Great Depression, but digital technologies provided a lifeline, enabling continuity for businesses, governments, and classrooms. The initial global response to the pandemic accelerated 2 years of digital transformation in just 2 months. As businesses look to find ways to remain operational, as employees embrace remote work, as governments digitalize their citizenship services and students connected online, We saw innovation and creativity surface through trends in the emergence and mainstreaming of digital technologies to achieve new capabilities, such as remote selling, enabling curbside pickups, telemedicine, and more. 20 months on, we are at a moment where we are increasingly looking forward and recognizing that we will come out of this pandemic. And it's not over yet, but it is a moment for us to reflect, in particular on the importance of technology and what we can take away from this collective experience. It has become clear that we are at an inflection point where the old ways of operating will no longer suffice. It's no longer business as usual, and normalcy has been redefined many times over the last 2 years. The digital economy presents 22.5% of global GDP, adding an estimated $1 trillion to ASEAN GDP over the next 10 years. Governments today have the advantages of innovation to leapfrog into the future. TV white space, for example, allows for Wi-Fi and internet connectivity to be provided using unutilized television spectrum. This access to technology has been life-changing as students and local businesses convert connectivity into economic opportunities, expanding their classrooms and markets from the physical to the digital realm. Micro, small, and medium enterprises account for up to 99% of business establishments, contribute to more than 50% of ASEAN's GDP, and employ more than 80% of the workforce in the region. MSMEs are responsible for significant GDP contribution, employment, and income generation opportunities, and have been identified as a major driver for poverty alleviation and development. However, despite being the backbone of the ASEAN economy, MSMEs are most vulnerable to economic slowdowns and shocks as they generally have fewer assets, limited cash reserves, lower levels of productivity, and operate at a smaller scale compared to their larger counterparts. In addressing multilateralism, we must develop MSMEs which are digital by design, equipped to serve beyond their markets and to reach regional and global audiences. At Microsoft, we take a shared responsibility and shared accountability approach, working with governments across the region to ensure MSMEs have access not only to technology, but more importantly, skills to enable a meaningful use and adoption of digital technologies. In addition to digital infrastructure, the pandemic has highlighted the powerful role that data can play in increasing resilience. Every day in recent months, in most instances, in addition to asking ourselves what the weather forecast is or what the headlines are, we have been tracking data as a community and as have countries around the world. What is the infection rate today? What is the vaccination rate? Every aspect of this pandemic has required a new level of data capability by governments, by businesses, by countries everywhere around the world. And this shows the way forward. It doesn't matter what the problem is, there is a good chance that a better use of data will be part of the solution. And for data to truly be part of the solution, governments must ensure data can flow across borders to where businesses need their data to be. The tendency for governments to place boundaries to restrict the movement of data through data residency requirements in the name of security will increase the cost of compliance by businesses without the added value of security. One of the fascinating things about any global crisis, whether it is a pandemic, a war, or any other challenge, is that it always drives innovation in certain areas at a faster pace. And this plays a critical role in helping humanity address the problem. This is certainly true with cybersecurity. Increasing economic resilience in the digital age has required us to reflect on the role of cybersecurity in enabling improved socioeconomic outcomes. Cybersecurity has become more pertinent as more of us come online. As the fastest growing internet market in the world, ASEAN sees an average of 125,000 new users every day. That number is attractive not only to legitimate businesses, but to cyber criminals as well. The past 2 years have witnessed not just the growth of cyber crimes, but as a proliferation in cyber attacks that is both new and disconcerting. This has included not only cyber attacks mounted for financial gains, but nation-state attacks as well. Governments and organizations are investing to build capabilities to secure their cyberspace. This will be a continuous journey, and more needs to be done to upskill and reskill its professionals and to build capacity to skill and train new cybersecurity professionals. No single entity can fight cybercrime effectively. Cybersecurity is a team sport, and our approach must reflect the global and multi-stakeholder nature of the internet, which is why Microsoft has launched the first Asia-Pacific Public Sector Cybersecurity Executive Council. It brings together a coalition of policymakers from government, state agencies, as well as technology and industry leaders with the aim of building a strong communications channels for addressing cyber threats and sharing best practices across the participating countries. Which leads me to my third factor, the tech policies. Technology can be a tool when used appropriately, but it can also be a weapon. Technology has advanced quicker than regulations can catch up. As governments look to amend or adopt new regulations and policies to address advancements in technology, it is important to ensure governments can build public trust through these policies and not just to restrict. Recently, as a company that provides services around the world, we joined hands with several other global technology companies to announce the Trusted Cloud Principles Initiative, which seeks to partner with governments to set the right tech policies and to resolve international conflicts of law that impede innovation, security, and privacy, and to establish and ensure basic protections for organizations that store and process data in the cloud. Through this initiative, we commit to working with governments to ensure free flow of data, to promote public safety, and to protect privacy and data security in the cloud with meaningful regulatory transformation as well. ASEAN has an opportunity to take the lead in adopting the Trusted Cloud Principles, which will not only provide security and assurance to users of cloud services, but will also position ASEAN as a leading destination for digital investments. Finally, skilling will be the currency for the post-pandemic world, powering the digital economy and resulting in societal and institutional transformation. Throughout crisis, innovation and challenges, people have been the common denominator. And in this instance, it is people who will drive digital transformation and resilience. As economies reopen and recover, the types of jobs required post-COVID have also evolved very quickly, and we need to equip the region with the right digital skills. Digital skills will accelerate digital economies, and it's our responsibility as leaders to make it happen by increasing access to skilling opportunities. But we also realize that no entity can do this alone. It is for this reason that we have developed digital alliances for digital-first policies, bringing together private sector, public sector, civil society, and academia to drive competitiveness, advance socioeconomic revitalization, and ensure digital native policies are formulated to meet the demands of the digital era. To build a truly resilient economy, we need to ensure every person can participate, learn, and contribute. That includes people with disabilities as well as women. In closing, opportunity with digital technology is endless, and it is as much about looking forward as it is about timeless values such as privacy, security, transparency, and trust, which is why our mission is deeply inclusive to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. As we continue forward, it will take a village, in this case, a global digital village, to ensure that we come out with this with more resilience, inclusion, and security. Let's use this as an opportunity to commit ourselves to put technology to work, to be the tool it can be to help the world address the next set of great challenges. I look forward to our conversation and collaboration as we move towards a more secure and resilient digital future for ASEAN. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sunny, for your very insightful presentation and analysis. And I agree with you that we now live in a global digital village, which we should make it inclusive and resilient. Right? And great that you share with us some of the projects and initiatives that Microsoft has been rolling out to help make possible this village. Thank you so much for that. Let's move on to our next speaker, Dr. Jay, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Karen, and good afternoon to everyone who's here today. I'm very pleased to be at another RSIS event, and I'm just going to pull up my short presentation. Please let me know if you can't see it or if anything goes wrong. If I don't hear from you, assume everything's fine. Right, so today I want to talk to you about global supply chains, especially in this region. And there's a bit of a spoiler alert with my title. It says global supply chains are more resilient than they appear. So you know what the bottom line is already. But I think a lot of the things that Sunny just spoke about are the good things that we are seeing happening, some of which as a result of the pandemic, some of which have already been in train for quite some time. And maybe the pandemic has accelerated it a little bit. But these are the types of initiatives that are increasing resilience and should be embraced. But I think the pandemic especially has led us to perhaps overestimate the need to increase resilience. The system is actually a lot more resilient than we think. And here I'm referring mainly to global supply chains. The initiatives to sort of increase resilience of supply chains has come out of the Indo-Pacific strategy and in many other forums and national discussions. And sometimes I think it's used as a way of moving away from multilateralism, which is another theme of this talk today. And it's a new name for old-fashioned protectionism. And more specifically, it might be a way of actually trying to push China out of global supply chains. So I think we need to be wary of good resilience or resilience as it's originally intended versus abuse of the term, when it's used to actually justify protectionism, or, as I said, this move to try and push China out of supply chains. But let me get going and start off by saying that I think the first point to note is that the pandemic is not the major disruptor as far as global supply chains or global value chains, as I use the terms interchangeably, as far as these things are concerned. It's more to do with the US-China trade war, in my view. The pandemic, of course, has accelerated the adjustment in supply chains, even perhaps the amount of adjustment. But it doesn't account for all of it, or indeed most of it, in my view. The thing we should remember, and it's easy to forget while we're still in this pandemic, is that the restructuring of supply chains started long before the pandemic or even the trade war. It started with rising wages in China and tightening of environmental rules. And in fact, supply chains are forever, adjusting and restructuring. That's how they're born. That's how they grow. In fact, that's their lifeblood. They're forever shifting and moving. Anyway, so when I first came interested in this topic, it was when I started reading about a lot of firms seemingly moving out of China very soon after the trade war broke out. That's more than 3 years ago, if you can cast your minds back. You couldn't pick up any financial newspaper at one stage to read about how some firm was moving out of China or moving into Vietnam or moving back to the US. There were lots of press reports about this. No hard data yet, but a lot of anecdotal evidence suggests that there was a lot of disruption soon after the trade war broke out. So the first question I was interested to try and answer was, why did this start happening so quickly, so soon after the first tariffs were raised in this trade war? And secondly, and related to that, is how could a relatively small bilateral tariff cause so much disruption to supply chains, resulting in seemingly costly relocation? So were supply chains really so fragile, or were they so needy, or so lacking in resilience that a small bilateral tariff could cause so much adjustment or change? Those were the two questions I was interested in originally when I started reading about all of this apparent shifts and moves out of China in the financial press mainly. So I think for the first question, why it happened so quickly, I think this relates to issues beyond pure economics. If the trade war is perceived as symptomatic of larger underlying forces at play, what we now often refer to as great power competition, then this is likely to endure long after any single dispute is resolved. So this is another way of saying the trade war is really not about trade, it's about global dominance. And it's just a symptom of that race or the efforts of the existing hegemon to tame the pretender to the throne, in this case China. So we've seen this play out before with Japan, with the Plaza Accord, and in some sense this has a lot of similarities to that episode, when that happened with the forced appreciation of the yen. But if this is true, that it's just symptomatic, then it will last a long time. And I think the way it's moved from trade to technology to intellectual property and everything else is indicative of this view, right? That it's more than just any trade dispute that's driving it. So if this is going to be with us for a long time, the quicker the adjustment, then the lower the costs, right? So I think firms will then see it in their interests to adjust to this as quickly as possible, thereby reducing the net present value of the long-term effects of benefits and costs. So that answers the speed question to some extent, but it won't happen though if it's not, if the shock isn't big enough to justify the adjustment, right? So this brings us to the second question. How is it that even a relatively small bilateral tariff can have such big effects? And I think the answer to this is directly related to global supply chains. And this is where the value added share, as opposed to the total value, comes into play. The tariff that, let's say, the US in this case is applying on imports is applied on 100% of the value, but not 100% of the value is produced in China, right? It's usually quite a small share, yet it's treated as a product from China, right? A made in China product. And to illustrate this point, let me show you this table where I've estimated the value added share of so-called Chinese exports to the US in 2018. So these are products that are treated as as being made in China when they arrive in the US, and they are slapped with the tariff, usually 25%. But as you can see in this third column, which is alpha, the value added share, it's a lot lower than 100%, of course, because of supply chains and the slicing of the value chain. In fact, for total manufacturing, it averages less than 1/3, 30.9% to be accurate. So if it's less than 1/3, then this has a magnifying effect on the tariff, right? To become more than 3 times the actual nominal rate. If it's 25%, it becomes more than 75%, it becomes 81%, right? So again, the simple logic here is that the tariff is applied on 100% of the value, but it's just the value added share that you need to remove from China to avoid 100% of the value being taxed. So if you remove 30% of the value added, that's enough to remove 100% of the tariff on the 100% of the value, right? So in this case, 25% becomes 81% for total manufacturing. So what does 81 actually mean? It means that Vietnam, for instance, may receive the activities currently taking place in China as long as they can do it for less than 81% higher of the current cost in China. So it's not 81% of the cost in China, but higher than the cost currently taking place in China. So it's quite a big buffer, as you can see, created by a 25% tariff. So a small tariff, bilateral tariff, can provide a magnified level of protection to everyone who competes with China for those activities currently taking place there. Everyone, not just the US, but anyone who competes with China. Right. So, so that's the magnifying effect produced by supply chains. And I think that's an important part of the story, but it's not the whole story. Apart from the value-added share, we need to consider the shares of fixed versus variable costs in understanding resilience of supply chains. And now, more than 3 years since the trade war started, we no longer have to rely on press reports or anecdotal data any longer. We have actual trade and investment data, and they all point to the remarkable resilience of supply chains. While there's been a lot of shifts in the labor-intensive segments of industries like textiles, clothing, and footwear, the key players in global supply chains, electronics, machinery, and transport equipment, have hardly budged and haven't moved out of China. And in fact, haven't moved much at all anywhere. And these industries are the ones that have quite high shares of fixed versus variable costs. And so it'll take a lot more than these tariffs to make them move. And so far, they have not moved. And the reason for that is because with high fixed costs, the technologies are less divisible. if you think about clothing, a lot of it is labor-intensive activities, stitching, sewing, etc. And usually the fixed costs are very simple workshops that can be easily dismantled. So it's quite easy to move them with low costs to another country or another site. But we often hear about ecosystem related costs in complex manufacturing. This includes everything from the warehouse, the sourcing of local inputs, building relationships with local suppliers, and everything else that goes into this complex manufacturing. And these things can't be divided up, and these things can be easily reestablished when you decide to move. So this is why I think we haven't seen as much movement in those machinery and transport equipment industries, but a lot more in the textile, clothing, and footwear industries, which have dominated the press reports in the early days.
Jay, you have 2 minutes.
Yeah, so sure. I'm just about to wrap up. So I think what this tells us is that despite the magnifying effect that on tariffs because of global supply chains, we still haven't seen huge amounts of movements in the key important supply chain industries. So this is why I say that global supply chains may be more resilient than they appear. So at face value, these tariffs are small, but in reality, their impact on costs are a multiple of the tariff rate, and yet we haven't seen that much movement of supply chains out of China in the important industries. Most of what we hear about is actually in the so-called footloose industries, textile, clothing, footwear, and related sort of sectors. But of course, going forward, we have to be fearful of escalation in this trade war. There is a price at which even these resilient industries will move, right? It's not that they are going to forever be resilient to shocks. If the price is right, then it will make sense for them to leave even China, despite the huge cost of doing so. And this can happen if this trade war escalates from just tariffs to non-tariff barriers of different types. With tariffs, we know what they are, we can measure them, and we can pretty much assess the impacts with accuracy. But with non-tariff barriers, things like, banning technologies and, not recognizing intellectual property rights, etc., these sorts of responses, if it happens, can actually cause huge disruption. And we know that, the effective rate of protection on a binding quota is infinity, right? So this type of non-tariff barriers, even the most basic like a quota, can have huge cost effects and can eventually cause even so-called resilient industries to shift if that were to happen. And that's what I think we need to be careful about going forward. Unfortunately, there doesn't appear to be any real end in sight for this trade war. So we hope that at least escalation can be contained if we are to minimize disruption and retain resilience. So I think resilience is there. It's a lot more than it appears on the surface. And I think the calls for increasing resilience and reshoring or nearshoring are perhaps exaggerated and driven more by domestic policy interests to try and return jobs. But I think this is unlikely to succeed unless we have a real massive breakout in this trade war, which, by the way, will not serve anyone's interests at all. Right, with that, let me stop there, Karen, and I'll look forward to the discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jay, for your very insightful presentation. Yes, I agree with you that this resilience, if we overdo it, it may lead to more reshoring or nearshoring, which creates inefficiency, right? So I think sometimes people confuse resilient with efficiency. So they think that maybe to reshore and nearshore, they would beef up the resilience. But I think that if you think another way, it's actually undercut your efficiency and eventually undercut your resilience going forward. But thank you so much for sharing it at the numbers, and also raise the issue of the US China power competition and the tariff and trade war that is a symptom of their competition, which actually leads to the fact that we have supply chain relocation, right? And you also mentioned about the effective rate of protection, that we have to think about effective rate of protection when we think about tariffs in the global value chain picture, right? So that is very another way to look at how supply chain shift is the main culprit, maybe the US China strategic competition rather than the COVID-19 pandemic itself. Okay, for the interest of time, let us move on to our last expert, Professor Kaiher. Professor Kaiher, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me right now? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and greetings from Brisbane, Australia. And first, many thanks to Karen and the RSIS for inviting me to participate in this timely and important webinar. It's really nice to meet some new colleagues and also see some old friends from RSS from the attendance list. So let me share my screen. Okay, so on today's topic, economic resilience and economic security, and today I think the first speaker talked about this topic from technology perspective, and the second speaker from the economic perspective, and my talk will from international relations perspective. And so I will talk about the economic resilience, security, and institutional balancing strategies of ASEAN as a group. So I would like to emphasize, economic resilience and the security, the all really extremely important topic, but really extremely important for ASEAN countries. So the reason is very simple. Because three reasons. One is ASEAN is a group of small and medium size of states who are more vulnerable economically if the world economy is in recession, and the transnational challenges as the pandemic, climate change, and the cybersecurity, those challenges are on the rise. So the root of ASEAN countries' vulnerability, or we call it economic security, lies in my view, is from international relation perspective, lies in, is the major root is because of its relationship and the connections with the outside world. So if you still remember in the 1990s, we praise the increasing globalization and the deepening economic interdependence among states, among ASEAN states, and among and especially between ASEAN states with the outside power, because economic interdependence, globalization are good things. They encourage more trade and investment among countries, and also help and benefit for economic growth for almost all countries. So during that time, we can see ASEAN countries are great beneficiaries of globalization. However, economic interdependence and also globalization can become a double-sided sword. When everything is good and beautiful, so ASEAN country, they do not need to worry about its over-dependency on outside powers. However, when the world economy is in trouble and the interdependency, especially the over-dependency between ASEAN and the outside power become a negative force, it will drag ASEAN down, especially because the asymmetric dependency, as I said, the over-dependency between ASEAN and outside power will put ASEAN country in a very disadvantageous situation. So traditionally, there are two approaches to address this we call the economic security or vulnerability problem. As I mentioned on the slide, one is to reduce ASEAN countries' economic dependency on the outside power through economic, trade, and the investment diversification strategies. I think Jay just talked about the trade war between China and the US. And if you remember, China also have a trade dispute with Australia. So what the Australian government do is to diversify its exports, not only to China, but to other countries. So it's kind of the diversification strategy is kind of the traditional strategy to strengthen a country's resilience, especially the economic security. The other strategy is to strengthen ASEAN countries' own resilience through some economic self-sufficiency strategy. From economic perspective, is probably is a protectionism, or just focus everything for the domestic consumer or domestic production. I would like to say there are good strategies, but it's a traditional strategy for states to deal with economic vulnerability or economic security problem. Actually, those strategies have been adopted to different degree by all countries, including ASEAN country, including China, and including Australia. For example, after the pandemic, many Western countries, such as US, Japan, have to consider how to diversify their supply chain to cope with the over-dependency on China. Some companies propose we call the China +1 strategy to move some capacity to ASEAN countries. To be honest, some ASEAN countries benefit from this ASEAN, this diversification strategy and create more business opportunity for ASEAN countries. However, I would like to say all opportunities come with risks. ASEAN countries might become even more vulnerable and more dependent on the outside power, with even possibility of competition or even trade dispute with China in the future. So in my view, I would like to propose a new, or we call the third strategy, which is called institutional balancing through ASEAN, not the individual ASEAN states, through ASEAN as a group, to strengthen economic security and the resilience for ASEAN countries. Institutional balancing is an international relations theory that I introduced some time ago. It suggests that states can utilize multilateral institutions to pursue their realist agenda and anarchy, and especially pursue power and the security and the prosperity. The ASEAN as a group has successfully employed this institutional balancing to pursue its security and economic interest in the post-Cold War era. Some example, we can see the ASEAN Regional Forum in the security domain, and also in the ASEAN regionalism, we can see the East Asia Summit, which is also use ASEAN as a, ASEAN always claim in the driver's seats, or the ASEAN centrality is very important for those regional, regional institution building. However, after 2008, we have witnessed a new wave of institution building, which I called multilateralism 2.0, led by great powers such as China and the US. China's Belt Road Initiative, the AIIB Initiative, Obama's TPP, as well as US free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, and the revived the Quad, and the newly established AUKUS as alliances. So to a certain extent, ASEAN's original leadership in multilateral institutions has becoming weak, because of other countries' challenge inside of multilateral institutions. It is a natural process according to institutional balancing theory, because ASEAN is conducting institutional balancing towards outside power. It's also normal for outside power like China and the US and Australia to conduct counterbalancing strategy towards ASEAN's role in multilateral institutions in the region. So in order to reduce ASEAN's vulnerability and strengthen its economic security, I would like to suggest ASEAN needs to revive its institutional balancing strategy towards the outside power. So there are three things I think ASEAN countries as a group need to do. First, ASEAN needs to strengthen its internal unity and cohesion in order to effectively balance against outside power. ASEAN needs to have a single and a strong voice. It's a big challenge actually right now for ASEAN because of the intra-regional or internal problem among ASEAN countries, especially the Myanmar issue. ASEAN needs to also think about how to establish effective leaderships inside of ASEAN. Please note I put leaderships is in the plural sense, not a singular leadership, because the leadership has different types. For example, there was structural leadership, there's ideational leadership, there's an entrepreneur leadership. In a word, ASEAN countries need to reestablish different types of leadership inside of ASEAN in order to effectively conduct this institutional balancing strategy. The third point I want to say is after strengthening the internal unity and the leadership, ASEAN needs to play an independent role in managing its relationship with US and China. Since vulnerability is rooted in over-dependency on one party, ASEAN needs to find a new way to navigate through the turbulence, the trade war caused by the strategic competition between US and China. So ASEAN did well in establishing the AIF and the EAS, through which ASEAN set up the institutional framework as well as the rules and the norms inside of the institution. It's a typical inclusive institutional balancing strategy. In my view, ASEAN will need to do more to revitalize this kind of institutional leadership role in the economic multilateralism, especially the climate change, the food security arena. As a group of middle and the small power, ASEAN might not be able to handle all the challenges alone. Here, I would like to suggest ASEAN needs to work with outside power, especially US and China, sharing the institutional leadership with outside power will be a good way to foster regional multilateralism while sustaining ASEAN's independence and the leadership status is also important in the regional affairs for ASEAN to establish its independent role in order to deal with this kind of economic vulnerability or security problem in the region. So it will not be an easy job, okay? As I said, from academic perspective, we can say in theory, ASEAN needs to do this, do that, but in reality, ASEAN faces a lot of challenges. However, in my view, ASEAN intends to, first the three things, as I have to emphasize that, clean up its own house and have a strong voice, and also strengthen its internal leadership framework in order to effectively conduct institutional balancing towards outside power. The last thing is to wisely conduct an institutional balancing strategy and play an independent role instead of taking sides between China and the US. And the most important thing, ASEAN should be smartly or wisely sharing its institutional leadership with outside power to deal with, to address those concrete challenges in the region. For example, the food security issue. So how China and ASEAN can work together, or ASEAN can work with Japan or the US together to deal with kind of the climate change challenges or the pandemic challenges. So different issue, ASEAN can play a different role, can find a different partner, which is with outside power. But ASEAN need to maintain its central or centrality role in order to deal with this kind of economic challenges and vulnerability in the region in the future. So I will stop here and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Kai-He, for your analysis about how ASEAN should how the strategic competition between the US and China has posed challenges to ASEAN, especially in the COVID-19 era, and what ASEAN should do to beef up their own economic security and resilience in this environment. So I would like to. We have about 40 minutes for Q&A, and let me remind the audience again that you can submit your question by clicking the Q&A button below, because the chat and raise hand function has been disabled for you. So the only channel for you to submit your question is the Q&A here. Okay, let me kickstart the Q&A, the discussion, with my own question. I just want to ask, I have a question for Professor Kai-He and also for Sunny. For Sunny, I think you touch on the fact that the MSMEs are the backbones of ASEAN economies, and I also totally agree with you that they are the most vulnerable when it comes to economic slowdown and the effect of the pandemic. And I think you also touch on the fact that the Microsoft has helped MSME to capitalize on digital economy going forward. But I would like to encourage you to perhaps share with us the specific projects that the Microsoft has been rolling out to help MSME in the regions. Maybe could you elaborate on that? That would be great. So for Professor Kai-He, I understand that you are calling for more institutional balancing that ASEAN should undertake going forward. And I think, I remember you mentioned ARF and EAS as a platform for ASEAN to beef up its leadership role in the region. Are there other platforms that, my question is, are there other platforms that ASEAN could leverage in order to, perhaps share institutional leadership or beef up its own institutional leadership going forward? Thank you. So let me start with Sunny. Could you share with us your specific project that Microsoft has been rolling out to help MSME in the region? Thank you.
Sure. So I guess one specific example that I can share with you first, before I go into more broad programs that we have, is in Indonesia, we partner with Grab, the transportation, the food delivery, and the mobile payment company, to help bridge the digital skills gap among underserved young people, and 1 million of their driver-owned and their spouses and their children, so that they're digitally skilled. So, and then what we do is, not only are we skilling them, but we're partnering with our partner ecosystem, so they have a place to go after they have been skilled up in digital skills. So that's just one example. And we partner, as I said before, this is not something that any one company or a government can do alone, but it really does take a village and partnership between the private and public sector. We're doing this not only in Indonesia, we're doing this in Singapore, we're doing this other places, not only in terms of MSMEs, but we also want to ensure that we are training the people with disabilities around the world as well. And I believe in Asia alone, there's almost 650 million people with disabilities. So we've launched a program called the Microsoft Enabler Program with business partners, and again, with nonprofits working together to improve the employability with people with disabilities in the region. And that is through the skilling training and as well as the job opportunities. We also have a program called Code Without Barrier, and that is focused on women to be educated and to get skilled in coding so that they can find more, better jobs after the post-COVID recovery. And that is going well. And that is also, we are working together with a partner so that they get trained and they get skilled and they have an ability to land a job as well. And another one that we're doing, and this is not within the ASEAN context, but that we've started in Korea, and then we will roll it out in other countries, is women in cybersecurity. So as I've said, we need a lot more cybersecurity experts. And hopefully after the COVID or the COVID recovery, we will be more embracing of hybrid workspace. So not only do you have to go to work, but you could work at home. And a lot of times for women, they leave the workforce because of family and children. And we want to be able to foster a work environment where you could work from home and still be able to contribute to the society. And one way that you could do that is with being a cybersecurity expert or a professional. You need a computer, you need a network to be able to do that kind of job. And so we're trying to promote women to come back and be trained to be cybersecurity experts. So those are just few examples of the things we're doing to ensure that people in the MSME, as well as the entrepreneurs and startups, to have that opportunity to skill up and to use technology.
Thank you very much, Sunny. That's a very excellent initiative that Microsoft has been rolling out to help the most vulnerable part of the society as far as the COVID-19 pandemic is concerned. So Professor Kai-He, could I get your thoughts on what would be the other platforms that ASEAN could leverage to maybe beef up its leadership? Thank you.
Yes, I think it's an excellent question, because traditionally ASEAN is a big player in the multilateral institutions, especially from the diplomatic perspective. During the, after the Cold War, the ARF and the EAS are very successful. But as I mentioned during my talk, right now, ASEAN faces a lot of challenges. It's not, it's not only from, the internal challenges, as I mentioned, but also outside challenge, especially from China and the US. So what I want to suggest is ASEAN, first, ASEAN need to revive its, its own institution, like what I mentioned, ARF and the ES, because right now both are criticized as a making process, not a progress. So if ASEAN wants to become relevant, and ASEAN needs to show some progress. I heard, there's some news about ASEAN is going to sign a code of conduct with China. I think that's kind of a progress. ASEAN can move forward. So that's kind of one thing ASEAN can show the outside power. It play a very important role to stabilize the situation, especially in South China Sea. For other, the institutional balancing means you can join an institution and ASEAN have a one strong voice and play important role. For example, right now the EAS is a very important platform, because people say, I criticize the Indo-Pacific concept does not have an institution, but the people say, oh, we have EAS, we have an East Asian Summit, because India is included in the EAS. So ASEAN can, play an Indo-Pacific card without register to the Indo-Pacific concept, which is to revive the EAS, which is play a leadership role to include the India in the institution and, create more progress. What I want to say is, very small things, the concrete things like economic security, pandemic, measurements, recovery plan to create some real progress, can show outside world, ASEAN can play a leadership role to cooperate with outside power to make a real progress in the regional affairs. I think that's the key. It's not to select different platform. I think ASEAN can play the EAS card without to say, I register for the Indo-Pacific to counter China, which is not a wise strategy in my view. Although ASEAN published its outlook on the Indo-Pacific concept several years ago, but I do not see any concrete progress on that Indo-Pacific concept. So what I suggested, ASEAN does not need to select different, a new platform. Just use the existing EAS will be a very important platform. Thank you.
Thank you. So it's about making progress and getting tangible outcomes. Okay, Thank you so much, Professor Kai-He. Let me move on to the question from the audience, and I think you also see it as well on in the Q&A box. So the first question goes to Sunny and Professor Kai-He. This is from Associate Professor Alan Chong, the head of CMS at RSIS. So he asked, one must reconcile the political economy and the market potential of ASEAN with its mostly low-tech profile. Do you agree? Singapore is the exception because the rest are still manufacturers and suppliers of the mid to low-tech products for SMEs. How does this handicap ASEAN's recovery going forward? Logistics, however, is pretty much low-tech, and here is where ASEAN can excel if you can get the governance act together. So what would be your thought on that?
So Professor, you could start or I could start?
No, Sunny, it's a more kind of a technology perspective. You can answer the question, yeah.
So I don't know if we need to necessarily reconcile whether it's a low-tech market or a high-tech market. I think the opportunity is if you don't have a lot of technology adoption now, right? The opportunity is you have less sunk cost, and you can build from now on, whether it's in the manufacturing or whether it's in the service industry or hospitality industry, whatever it may be. One of the challenges that I've seen around the world in various different markets is, for instance, Japan and Korea boasted they're the IT powerhouse, right? And in some ways, because they were, or maybe they are still at IT powers, but there's a lot of sunk cost in the investments that they made, that it was very difficult them to embrace new technology going forward. So for instance, cloud, I think because they have their own data center, because they have a large infrastructure in place right now, is really difficult sometimes for them to move into this new technology to embrace whatever's available, the latest in the marketplace. So I think in that sense, for ASEAN and for many of these companies where they have not invested as much. And as I was mentioning in my presentation, this is an opportunity for them to leapfrog. So if I could give you an example of, when I was in the US, you had the voicemail, you had the beepers, and you had all these different technologies get to maybe the smartphone. But I think in some of the other markets, you skip some of the middle part and you went straight to smartphone. So I think there is an opportunity for ASEAN to be able to leverage the technology that's available now, and it's a great equalizer. The technology that we're using at Microsoft is the same technology that even an SMSE can use to make sure that they could get the latest and the greatest and get the protection that we have. So hopefully they would leverage and embrace that opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, Alan, for the excellent question. There were three very quick points, and one is, in my view, ASEAN cannot recover its economy by itself. So that's why ASEAN has to work with the outside power, especially the US, China, Japan, to recover its economy. So that's why I think it's not in ASEAN's interest to see the economic trade war or even Cold War or decoupling between China and the US. because the best ASEAN can do, the ideal word for ASEAN is to see a globalized world. So ASEAN can tap into this kind of globalization and economic independence and benefit from this kind of economic interdependence. So I think in the future, ASEAN country needs to work closely cooperate with outside power, especially China and the US, in order to get an economic recovery. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kai. I think we have
Karen, can I just add
something?
something? Yeah.
Please.
Okay. No, I was just wanting to add to what Professor Zeni just mentioned about ASEAN's dependence on the outside world. I think, as we've already mentioned, this trade war has seen some ASEAN countries benefit with the inflow of FDI, with the relocation of some of the labor-intensive segments, at least, of the supply chain. Vietnam, Thailand, and even Malaysia has seen some increases in the early phase. But I think what the Prof said is very true in the sense that ASEAN as a whole will not benefit in the long term if this trade war continues. I mean, we know that there are some countries that benefit and others that don't, but overall, in the long term, we all lose out if this trade war persists. And it's partly because even this relocation has efficiency losses associated with it when it comes out from the most effective or most efficient producer, which is currently, where it is, which is China, right? So I think that's something to bear in mind, that there is, beggar thy neighbor policies are limited in terms of how they can benefit the world and even these individual countries in the long term. And we would all be better off if we could get an early resolution to this trade war, if possible. Thanks.
Okay, yes, I agree that the idea would be the trade war is over and we have, US and China working together, working more together. And maybe just to ask another question from the audience and just to, continue on this flow of discussion. I think you mentioned about, we talked about geopolitics, right? US-China trade war, and this is the question from Assistant Professor Lee Su-yan from CMS2, and she's asking about, so I think that the general question is, what do you think would be the impact of US-China tensions on ASEAN economic security? Because, Biden administration has been keeping and will keep most of the Trump's tariff intact, Trump trade policy intact, right? So with these ongoing geopolitical issues, it might pressure ASEAN to choose sides, right? So how would ASEAN go forward? Would ASEAN be able to remain neutral or pursue ideal vision of multilateralism politically and economically? So what do we think? I mean, I think, so just to maybe paraphrase it a bit, it's kind of like we are walking on a tight position now with China and US, competing against each other. So what would be the way forward for ASEAN?
You want me to ask?
I think she doesn't specify the panelists, so I think it's open for all of you to chip in. Thank you.
Yeah, if I want to say it's not an easy job for ASEAN states. If we see ASEAN states as 10 countries have a middle power, small power, I think it's natural from a geopolitical perspective. The US and China will push those individual countries to take sides. Actually, all the leaders need a follower. So basically, they need some follower to follow their, leadership. But what I want to suggest is ASEAN, if they treat as an individual country, they're powerless. They do not have power to they will be pushed around by US and China and Japan. But if they work together, and they can say, we take the ASEAN position instead of Cambodia's position, instead of Singapore position. But what I want to say is, in the first, the point is you have to have a strong voice or internal cohesion among ASEAN countries. I think it's a collective, interest for all ASEAN countries. But in order to make that cohesion, we, ASEAN need to have an effective leadership. So the leaderships is not only one leader. It have to collective leadership. I think ASEAN need to consider that. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kaira. Let's move on to the next question by Dr. Dipinder from ISIS too. So this is for, the question goes to Dr. J. So the question is, when companies consider relocating parts of the value chain, the decision is also shaped by cost differentials in the services sector. In ASEAN, for example, where the services sector is quite sheltered, could you conjecture on how could liberalizing services could motivate shifts in value chains? What bearing is RCEP likely to have on this? Is there any evidence out there on how servicification of manufacturing has impacted relocation decisions? So Jay, please, what are your thoughts on these?
Right, yes, thank you, Karen. Well, this is a very good but difficult question. I think this is the difficulty we face now, which has come out of, I guess, the spread of supply chains as well, right? Getting a grip on the true sort of value-added shares in each country is increasingly difficult. I showed you some numbers earlier on for 2018 for so-called Chinese exports to the US. This is very, I had to look at very detailed input-output data, try to take into account multiple border crossings of parts and components. Even after doing all that, we don't know if you really, got it that right in terms of measuring, where the value, the true shares of value added are being produced across, so many different countries, especially because of this double counting with the multiple border crossings. On top of that is this whole certification issue, right, which adds another layer of complexity. But I think the point being made is a very good one, which is that, ASEAN has lagged behind in opening up its services sector. This is where barriers are still quite high, and some of them are very high, like infinity because of restrictions that are binding. And ASEAN could, in fact, gain a lot by bringing down those barriers and engaging more in supply chains if they did. So I think that's the potential there for increasing participation. In terms of resilience, I think, again, it adds to the difficulty of moving these segments around when there's a shock. I think the services element is usually tied in to technology and royalties, and sometimes even after-sales service, retailing. All these things are usually, quite immobile, or they have a country specific aspect to them. So it will take a very big shock to actually dislodge these types of service-related value added. So in short, I think certification complicates things, but it adds to resilience. But if ASEAN were to address the huge barriers in their services sector, they could benefit a lot more from participation in supply chains. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but it's a difficult one, but an important one.
I think you answered it very well. Thank you, Jay. Actually, we have one more question for you. This is by Jose. Sorry, Sorry, I skipped that. So it's another two more questions for you, but I just want to ask one first. This is from Bing San Seng. It's about RCEP. So he would like to know your broad views on RCEP and its challenges / implications on the structure of ASEAN supply chain in the coming years, and how important it is for India to be part of RCEP.
Right. Okay. Sorry. Actually, the earlier question from Devinda also mentioned RCEP. I forgot to talk about it, so I'm glad to give a second chance. Yeah. So RCEP, I think, is all about consolidating regional supply chains. All the players in this region that are involved in the supply chain are part of RCEP, and we've heard a lot about how the single rule of origin will be an important aspect to, simplifying things for firms, especially MSMEs, that find it quite difficult to navigate this noodle bowl of agreements that have emerged. So I think that's an important aspect to RCEP in helping simplify those rules for small firms especially. But I think RCEP can do a lot more than that. And RCEP is designed in a way to allow members to go as far as they feel they can when they feel they can. So it's a very loose, it's binding, but it's loosely binding. We know that, the ASEAN way is not to rush to court every time someone doesn't comply with a particular type of requirement. It's based on, selling the benefits of reform. And if we can do that, I think RCEP, by dealing with services, liberalization, some progress on data flows, that's going to be an important part of this whole story. If they can actually move that forward for countries that are not in these digital agreements yet, I think that will also help with the supply chains and increasing the resilience of supply chains. So there's a lot of potential there, but we'll have to wait and see how much actually happens, because as I said, RCEP is not, it's treaty based, but implementation has always been a bit of an issue. We have seen that with the AEC, with ASEAN. Hopefully it'll be a bit better with RCEP. So if countries do go ahead and implement these accords they've signed up for, it can have huge benefits, I think, for supply chains operating through services and digital trade. Yeah.
Thank you, Jay. There's one more question for you, and I'm going to use, because we talked about RCEP already, and then I'm going to use it as a segue into another question for you. This is from Jose. So he asked about what would be the second best policy for ASEAN if the trade war cannot be resolved. So let me read his writing here. So he said that you share about the ongoing challenges to economic resilience even before the COVID in forms of barriers to trade. Do you see this as a part of the new normal since 2016? If the trade war cannot be resolved, then what is the optimal second best policy approach moving forward? So as we have been talking about RCEP, is the RCEP one of the second best policy approach for ASEAN in this situation?
Yeah, I guess, RCEP is sort of a bit of an insurance policy against, a world increasingly being carved up into blocks. So, I guess it's also, part of that whole second best process of, regional blocks. But I think, what we really need to focus on here is how the supply chains are so interdependent that, there's no real regional supply chain. Even in RCEP or ASEAN, the regional supply chain is linked into the global economy, right? A lot of the markets for the final goods produced in the regional supply chain are outside in Europe and in North America. So a trade war that escalates out of control is going to have huge costs, whatever we try and do with domestic insurance policies, unfortunately. And hopefully that in itself will be a deterrent, right? Because there are no winners in this trade war if it escalates, or even if it doesn't escalate, but especially if it escalates. So hopefully the realization that the cost will be so high will stop it from happening. But there is no foolproof insurance policy. But RCEP is one way, I guess, of reducing those costs. But what I fear even more is the subtle changes taking place, right? Where you have this rise in anti-globalization sentiment. The trade war is one very explicit and noticeable aspect, but the subtle aspects where now it's becoming harder for people to move across borders. Here, I'm not talking about tourism, that's a separate issue. But long after we are over this horrible pandemic, I wonder if the barriers that have been raised in the name of the pandemic will remain a lot longer than they need to be. Already we have seen Malaysia talking about how they might not need as many foreign workers. And I think that's very short-sighted. And luckily Singapore hasn't gone down that path. I think they've recognized all the way the importance of foreign workers in keeping the real exchange rate competitive and non-traded costs low. But many other countries, I think, are now finding it quite easy to retreat back into looking inward, and barriers that have been raised, I think, may remain in place longer than they have to. That's my fear going forward. Yeah.
Right. And just to touch back on what you said in your presentation, that the fear is also about the rise of non-tariff barriers, right? That could happen from, that could be the policy that the country roll out to,
Absolutely.
challenges, and that could be the problem because we cannot really, because it's a huge umbrella of protectionist measures, right, under NTB, and it's very, very difficult to deal with.
And it's a moving target as well. So every time we address one of them, another one pops up in its place in a different disguise. So it's yeah, that's right. That's the concern. Non-tariff barriers, not tariff. Tariffs are good. Well, they're not good, but they're easier to manage.
Exactly.
Non-tariff is the problem.
Yeah. Right. So it's a challenge going forward. So let me try to go through the remaining question here. There's one question for Sunny. This is from Dr. Deepinder. So he asked, companies think and behave differently from what politicians, or for that matter, policymakers, proclaim and would like them to do. Aside from strong and blunt measures such as banning export of key technologies or products, could you share your observations on how companies, including those primarily in the services sector such as Microsoft, make decisions to relocate, especially in the current fractious geopolitical environment? Sunny, please.
Yeah, thank you. So not so much for us, but when we talk to our customers and they think about or they consider, going deeper into any one country or making more investment into one country, there are a few factors. I'm sure there are a lot of different reasons why a company would choose one country over another for investment. But what we've seen from, and this is from a technology perspective, is really one is regulatory clarity. A lot of times, as I said, data is the lifeblood of an organization. And for many of these organizations who may be located outside of ASEAN and they want to come into ASEAN, they want to be ensured that their data is going to have the kind of protection that they expect to have in that country as well. So they look to privacy regulation, they look to cybersecurity regulations, they look to see how law enforcement officers will get access to their data, especially when the data is sitting up in a cloud. And so these are some of the things that they would ask us to see whether or not, Microsoft, are you going to go into a certain country and build a data center? Because we want to make sure we want to go in there and we feel a lot more secure if you're going to be in that country as well, as opposed to putting their data in, some other data centers that is operated or owned by another third party, I suppose. So that is one. I think another one is just the potential to transfer data around. Many times there's, I think, this tendency, and perhaps this comes more often these days because of protectionism and nationalism. And in some sense, it is a non-tariff barrier that the companies or the countries place, where they make it difficult for data to flow. And they do it in the name of either, the security or national security or privacy. But as companies, even within the ASEAN countries, let's say, you want to provide something similar to Grab, let's say, or Food Panda, where you're providing a food service and you're going from one place to another country, and you want to make sure your data is sitting closer to that country where the customers are, so you have less latency, for instance. But if the companies or the countries are not allowing you to move your data around as freely as you need it to be, then I think you would probably take that into consideration as well as you move into one country or another. So aside from, of course, the tax and the labor force and all that other stuff, but I think what we're seeing more and more is whether or not there is this regulatory clarity, and whether or not they have the protection they need from the government with respect to data.
All right, thank you so much, Sunny. And I think because our time is almost up, so I would like to give a very brief concluding remarks before we leave. So as you can see, this webinar focuses on economic resilience and economic security. And as you can learn from our distinguished panelists, that this is it's a big question that we have to think through how to live up these two, the economic resiliency and economic security going forward, and the challenges that not only private sector is facing, but also governments and ASEAN is facing too. And just would like to giving a few words here that we would like to thank you so much for those of you in the audience that have chipped in and asked questions. And I would like to also thank our panelists, Sunny, Dr. J, and Professor Kai-Her for their very insightful analysis and discussion that we had today. And I hope that you can join us again next time. RSIS has upcoming webinars. So if you like, you can check out our website. Is www.rsis.edu.sg. So you can go to that website to check out our upcoming webinars or even our publications. And we are also on social media as well. You can search our school name, RSIS, on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or YouTube. So again, thank you very much for joining us. And I hope you enjoy this webinar, and I hope to see you next time in our future conferences or workshops or webinar. Well, have a good day and have a pleasant evening. Thank you.